"What's your secret?" people would often ask Evelyn. "A little bit of patience and a lot of champagne," she would laugh. If only that was a joke. Evelyn and Fred had been married for 10 years. High school sweethearts, as cliché as you would find them. The two were inseparable. They had never known love outside of each other, nor did they desire it. Fred had always been so good to her. He would validate and consider her every emotion and thought, and treat her better than she felt she deserved. For years, she thought she was the luckiest person alive. That was, until she met his mother. It had not been long since their graduation when the two had decided to get married. They were 20 and madly in love. It was a particularly starry night, and they were in each other's arms, gazing at the illuminating canvas surrounding them. This was an activity that they both enjoyed often, but there was something different in the air that night. It came up as a joke, the idea of marriage. Fred teased Evelyn, saying that they were around each other so often, they may as well have been married. Evelyn didn't laugh. She didn't find it funny. In fact, the thought of it made her heart pound. Being able to spend the rest of her life with the only person she truly loved sounded like a dream. Evelyn didn't have the best home life. Her dad left her and her mom when she was 4, and her mom never stopped blaming her for it. Fred's family, on the other hand, adored her. They knew her background and showered her with the affection that her own mom so cruelly deprived her of. Evelyn also knew that Fred's mother, Julie, had a soft spot for her. Fred had 3 brothers and no sisters. He'd always been the closest to his mom, and when he saw that she and his girlfriend clicked the very day he brought her home for the first time, he'd been thrilled. She treated Evelyn like the daughter she had never had. All of which was why Evelyn responded to Fred's lighthearted comment with, "Why don't we do it?" Needless to say, Fred was taken aback. He was only 20, and nowhere close to being financially stable enough to support the two of them, let alone himself. But all it took was a moment, and one look at Evelyn's eager face and bewitching eyes for him to lose all sense of practicality. He couldn't find it in him to say no. His initial, alarmed expression slowly softened, and he smiled. "Let's." Lost in each other's arms and the idea of a future together, the two spent the rest of the peaceful night pondering in silence. The very next morning, they decided to go to Fred's home first with the news. They weren't sure how it would be received, but they were optimistic that it wouldn't be unwelcome. Hand in hand, they approached Tim, Fred's oldest brother. Fred had always been closest to him. He was utterly confused, of course. "What's the rush?" "We don't see why we have to wait," Evelyn retorted. While Fred enthusiastically nodded in support despite his head being flooded with concerns the previous night. "You do you, I guess," Tim shrugged. They were a little disheartened by his reaction. They thought at least Tim, of all people, would be happy for them. Shrugging their disappointment off, they decided to go next to Fred's dear mother. It could not have gone worse. The grin on her face that appeared the moment they had walked in disappeared the moment they shared their news, as though it was never there. "No, you aren't," was all she said. They looked at her in disbelief. Tim's reaction was nowhere near as bad as Fred's mom's. But as the saying goes, love is a force to be reckoned with. They had already made up their minds, and nothing was going to get in the way of that. Or so Evelyn thought. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Fred asked. Evelyn was hurt. Ever since they had spoken to his mom, he'd looked conflicted. As upset as Evelyn was by his hesitation, she could understand why he would feel that way. It was different for her. Her mother couldn't care less about what she did with her life and her future. If anything, she would be glad that Evelyn would no longer be around. Fred, on the other hand, was very close to his family. He was a mama's boy, and her opposition to their union was definitely going to be their biggest obstacle. "Please, let's do it." Maybe Evelyn was being selfish right now. Some might say she was that much in love with Fred. Others might say she was just looking for a way to escape her own home. To Evelyn, it was a bit of both. It took a while to convince him, but eventually Fred agreed. Julie was still not happy. This stung Evelyn because the two of them had always been close. "I'll win her back," Evelyn told herself. This was only the beginning, and they were going to be a family. She had won her heart once and was sure she could do it again. The wedding went well. Her mom didn't attend, but Evelyn was hardly surprised. All of Fred's brothers loved Julie, so despite the initial shock they had all felt, they welcomed her into the family with open arms. To her disappointment, the only brother that didn't seem too keen about the marriage was still Tim. She was confused, but didn't think too much of it. Perhaps he would get used to it eventually. They couldn't find their own place as of yet. They couldn't afford it. Settling into Fred's household was a lot more challenging for Julia than she thought it would be. On her first night in their home, Julie set the table for exactly 6 people. There was no space for Evelyn. "There are 7 of us now, Mom," Fred chuckled nervously. "Oh, how silly of me. It's going to take me a while to get used to this," Julie responded with a tight smile. "No problem. I can take my plate to the couch," Evelyn assured, not wanting to inconvenience Fred's mom even further. Fred looked horrified. "Don't be silly. You can just—" "Oh, aren't you a dear? Thank you, dear." Julie cut him off. Fred looked uncomfortable but didn't keep pushing. Forcing a chuckle and trying to hide her embarrassment, Evelyn served herself a plate and made her way to the couch. Fred could have at least offered to join her, she thought, but it seemed as though the idea hadn't even crossed his mind. "I'm sure he just doesn't want to offend Julie. He's upset her enough already," Evelyn consoled herself. Yes, that must have been it. She felt the couch dip next to her and she looked up. To her surprise, it was Tim. "I usually watch TV while I eat. You can take my spot," he said, without sparing as much as a glance in her direction. She smiled. Her pride wouldn't let her return to the table, but at least she now had company. Maybe Tim didn't mind her being around as much as she thought he did. Despite the cold treatment she had received that night, Evelyn made a resolution to herself that she was going to earn her place in their family. That night after dinner, while she helped Julie wash the dishes despite her protests, Evelyn offered to cook breakfast the next morning for the family. "No, it's fine. The boys are quite picky about their meals," Julie said, immediately turning the offer down. But Evelyn kept insisting. She always cooked for herself because her own mom refused to, and she also knew what type of breakfasts Fred's family typically enjoyed because she used to come over often, even before they had got married. Finally, Julie gave in. She woke up early the following day in high spirits. People had often told her how great of a cook she was. Her cooking would definitely win them over. Determined, she immediately took to the kitchen. The entire night she had carefully thought out exactly what she would be making, and Evelyn was intent on doing it right. 2 hours later, she was done. She could hear bustling outside of the pantry. "They must be up. Perhaps I should go set the table now," she thought. Pleased with herself, she made her way to the dining room, humming a cheerful tune all the while. All of a sudden, she stopped in her tracks, and her face dropped. "I saved a seat for you this time, dear," Julie beamed at her, as if they were the best of friends. The rest of the family was already there eating. Fred giggled at his mom's comment, but stopped when he turned to Julie. He could see the horror on her face, but could not seem to understand why. Tears gathered in Evelyn's eyes. She refused to let them fall. She turned to Julie, her lips pursed, and in the calmest voice she could muster at the moment, she said, "I thought you said I could make breakfast for all of you today. I've been in the kitchen for the last 2 hours." Fred, his father, and their brothers looked appalled. They all turned to Julie, who seemed to be both surprised and apologetic. She said, "Oh, my dear, I'm so sorry. I should have told you before. On Sunday mornings, we order in." Evelyn's tears threatened to fall. This had to have been on purpose. It had been barely 10 hours since they had discussed this. How could Julie have forgotten? "It's fine. I'll go clean up. Maybe you can snack on what I've made if any of you feel hungry later," Evelyn said, putting on a brave face and walking out. "Thank you so much, dear. I'm sure we will love it," Julie called after her. Evelyn knew that Julie was doing this to her on purpose. She did her best not to feel discouraged, and month after month, Evelyn just kept trying, but to no avail. A little less than a year in, she had had enough. She knew that Fred was aware of how his mom was treating her. She brought it up to him a few times as well, but he always found a way to defend his mom. She didn't understand how someone who was always so kind and thoughtful, especially towards Evelyn, could be so indifferent to the abuse she was going through under her mother-in-law. It hurt Evelyn deeply that the only person she could trust refused to take her side. Yet somehow, after months of persuasion and floods of tears shed, Fred finally agreed to her request to move out. They were going to get their own place. It wasn't too far from Fred's parents' house, but it was far enough for Evelyn. As long as she was under Julie's roof, Evelyn would never have been able to enjoy her married life. The mental abuse did not stop there. Fred would still constantly drag Evelyn to his family's home for meals, or simply to spend time with his family. Despite having moved out, they were at this house almost every day of the week, and it was never enjoyable for Evelyn. If Julie wasn't picking on her, she would be doing the most to make her look like a bad, lethargic wife who had no care for her husband. She would find fault with everything Evelyn did. It was suffocating, but there was nothing she could do. She was the one who had wanted to get married early after all. It had now been 10 years since the childhood sweethearts had decided to get married. You would think that by now things were better for Evelyn. But no, Julie still did her best to make every living moment around her hell, while Fred was so blinded by reason that he did not consider how terrible it made Evelyn feel. Evelyn never left Fred. Despite his mom being his Achilles heel, he would still constantly dote on Evelyn, and do his best to compensate for the strain that their mother was putting on their relationship. She knew Fred was a mama's boy. Still, the fact that he had never considered leaving Evelyn, despite Julie's disapproval, was proof enough of how much love he had for her. Low standards for a relationship, but to Evelyn, it was enough. It was Fred's father's birthday the coming Tuesday, but Fred was going to be missing the celebrations because he had an important business that he could not get out of at the very same time. To make this up to his dad, he decided to take him on a road trip, just the two of them, and visit the lake his father grew up next to. They were going to go fishing, an activity his dad used to enjoy immensely in his childhood, but never had time to do as an adult. This left Evelyn home alone. It wasn't that she enjoyed time away from Fred, it was just that she barely ever had time for herself as of late, and so, this weekend, she had a whole evening of self-care planned. On finishing up the last of the work she had left, Evelyn was just getting ready to completely unwind when all of a sudden, Julie barged in. Evelyn was stunned, to say the least. She was unaware that Julie even had keys to their home, but she decided not to ponder on it. Today was going to be a good day, and she was not about to let her headache of a mother-in-law ruin it for her. "To what do I owe this pleasure?" Evelyn asked, eyebrows raised, barely moving from her seat. "Get out of my house," Julie responded. "This is my house, thank you very much. I could very well ask the same of you." Evelyn wasn't even slightly alarmed by this outburst. She had witnessed much worse in their time together. Nothing surprised her anymore. Julie stormed into the kitchen and brought out their biggest knife. "If you don't want to leave, I can help you." She had the eeriest grin on her face. Evelyn sat up. She was no longer unbothered. She and Julie had had countless disputes in the past, but despite the verbal threats to end each other, Julie had never actually brought out a weapon. Evelyn was concerned. There was barely any build-up to their argument either. Everything had happened so fast. Something was different this time. Something was very wrong. "Whoa, put that down, Julie. Use your words." Evelyn laughed nervously. She wasn't sure if making light of the situation would calm Julie down or anger her even more, but she wasn't left with that many options. "Words? Oh, I'm done with that. You took one baby from me and I let that happen, but two? That's where I draw the line. You will never be good enough for either of them. It makes me sick enough to think that he would love the wife of his own brother, but to make it worse, it had to be you?" Evelyn had no clue what Julie was talking about. "What are you saying? I'm sure we can talk it out. Please, put the knife down." She was now standing, the only thing protecting her from her demise being the table between them. Julie wasn't even listening anymore. She circled the table, waving the knife in front of her. Julie was getting closer. Evelyn's heart dropped when she realized that Julie reeked of alcohol. Even if she tried to talk some sense into Julie right now, the chances that it would actually get through to her were close to nil. She didn't know what to do. They continued circling the table, while Evelyn tried to figure out the best way for her to escape without turning her back on Julie. It was too risky for that. She grabbed her cell phone off the desk and tried to speed dial Fred without taking her eyes off Julie, in the hopes that her son would be able to speak some sense into her. This didn't work. The next few seconds were a total blur. Julie charged toward Evelyn. Evelyn made a sharp turn. This didn't bode well with her ankle, because almost immediately she buckled. Her head hit a sharp surface, and all of a sudden, everything was dark. She woke up in an unfamiliar room, her hand cuffed to the rail of the bed that she was on. She sat up, wincing, as everything around her started spinning. Her head was bandaged, and so was her hand. Fred walked into the room. "You killed my mom!" he cried. "I know you didn't like her, but how could you?" Fred was in utter agony. In that moment, a million emotions flooded Evelyn. She was bewildered and in anguish. As far as her memory served, the last thing she remembered was her mother-in-law charging at her, knife in hand. How could she have killed her when she didn't even have a weapon? Fred continued. "Oh, and he confessed, but I don't believe him. No one does. I'm sure you manipulated him into doing this. He's always had a soft spot for you. Once we prove that you were the actual murderer, he'll be out of custody." Soft spot? Who was Fred talking about? "I loved you, but she was my mother. I won't let you get away with this." Fred had completely turned on her. He was so overwhelmed by Julie's murder that any love he had left for Evelyn seemed to have disappeared. He didn't even ask how she was. He didn't even want to hear her out. Not that she could have defended herself if he did. Every time she opened her mouth to speak, no words would come out. But he had already made up his mind. Evelyn's heart hurt more than her head did. She really had no one now. Her head suddenly started spinning again. Fragments of a memory started appearing in her head. Everything was foggy, but she could still see. Her eyes fluttered open as a figure stood over her body on the floor. Their hands were covered in the blood of a lifeless being, and they were convulsing. the tears falling from their face mixed with the red substance that seemed to be everywhere. "I'm sorry, Mama. I'm so sorry. Please wake up. I didn't mean it." The figure continued to plead. Still, no response. His head hanging, he turned to Evelyn with the most pitiful look on his face. Her eyes widened, and she gasped, "Tim? Tim!" He must have been who Julie was talking about that night. Had they got into an argument over her? He must have followed her home to apologize. It was all coming back to her now. It all made sense. She looked at Fred. The hatred in his eyes was a fire that could not be extinguished. All she knew was that despite everything, Tim had saved her life. If not for him, she wouldn't be here. So Evelyn would protect him. If her husband thought she was guilty, then so be it. She had lived the last few years in misery because of this tyrant of a woman, and thanks to her, Evelyn had now lost the only good thing in her life as well, Fred. She had nothing left for her here. "The defendant pleads not guilty," the prosecutor challenged. They were pushing the narrative that Evelyn had acted out of self-defense. "Do you feel remorse for your actions?" the judge asked. Evelyn looked up and smiled. She had it coming.